Welcome to yet another in a series of foreign policy conversations with the Perth USAsia Center. My name is Gordon Flake, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Lynn Kuok, who's the Shangri-La Leadership Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security at the IISS. For those of you who don't know the acronym IISS, that's the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a London-based think tank with a long-time presence in Singapore, who hosts the annual Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, as you might guess, at the Shangri-La Hotel. The Shangri-La Dialogue is really the preeminent security gathering, security forum in the Asia Pacific, and it has been since its inception, regularly drawing the ministers of defense from almost every major country in the region and beyond. And it's something that this year, unfortunately, was canceled for the first time ever due to the effects of COVID-19. But all that has done is raise our anticipation for 2021. I must say, June, it's just not June without being in Singapore and interacting with the wonderful folks from throughout the region who think seriously about these issues. Lynn, in her position at IISS, also oversees one of the premier publications of that institution, its Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment, which was launched in June of this year, June 5th of this year. Lynn can talk a little more about that later on. But she also heads up the dynamic IISS Southeast Asia Young Leaders Program. I should note that that Lynn continues to maintain an affiliation as a senior research fellow at the University of Cambridge and has held fellowships at Yale, at Harvard Law School, at the Harvard Kennedy School, at the Center for Strategic International Studies, at Brookings, as well as the NUS. I am noting, Lynn, that one thing is missing there, and that is an organization here in Australia to entice you down here for a long period of time. But that's not for lack of trying. In just the last week alone, Lynn was a speaker at the Australian National University's annual Crawford Forum. She joined panelists former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, as well as former US Ambassador to the UN Samantha Power. Also last week, she did a wonderful webinar for the Australian Institute for International Affairs on the South China Seas. And a couple of weeks ago was a panelist on a magnificent panel that our partners at La Trobe Asia did on the South China Seas. For those of you who might be interested, just Google Lynn Kuok or Google, go to YouTube and search by her name. You'll find links to all of those. They're also on her Twitter feed. Viewers here in Perth will recall Lynn's star turn last year in August at our second annual WA Indo-Pacific Defense Conference. Lynn, while we were there, we noted, and I think you noted as well, that the community here in WA is a little bit different. One of the fundamental assumptions behind our creation 7 years ago is that perspectives on the world are a little bit different in Perth. We are the actual antipodes away from Washington, D.C. In other words, where I'm sitting now, you cannot get farther on the planet on land away from Washington than we are here. But we also are just as close to Singapore as we are to Sydney, closer to Jakarta than we are to Canberra, and in the same time zone as Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila, and Beijing. And as a result, our viewership, the nearly 10,000 people who kindly pay attention to the work and writing and these types of conversations that we send out on a newsletter are increasingly not just in Australia, but up in the region, in Indonesia, in Singapore, in India, and Japan. And so we're delighted to have the opportunity to introduce you, your thinking, and your research to our audience. And in that context, I thank you. Thank you for giving us time this morning. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Gordon. That was a really kind introduction. I was delighted to receive your invitation, particularly because I had such a wonderful time at the Western Australia Indo-Pacific Conference that you organized last year, talking about preeminent conferences. That was certainly one of them. I really enjoyed it. It was a huge gathering, but everyone was so warm and welcoming. So I'm very happy to be here today with you.
Well, we remain warm. I don't know how welcoming we are. I'm afraid that WA is kind of a bubble within a bubble, as we're still sealed off from the rest of Australia, let alone the rest of the world. But our hopes is that one of the very first international linkages that we really establish will be Singapore, and we can entice you down here in person. But thanks again for doing this virtually. I thought we might kick off with the segue from what we were just talking about. Last year at the WA Indo-Pacific Defense Conference, you gave some very insightful remarks about the fundamentals of the security dynamics in the region more broadly. And you highlighted the twin concerns of growing anxiety about the United States and its reliability and growing assertiveness by China. I wonder if we could just start off with a question of continuity and change. 10 months on from your remarks last August, have your views changed? Has the world changed? Have they stayed the same? What are the dynamics we should be paying attention to?
Well, I think, Gordon, that the change has come mainly from the rate of change as opposed to any difference in the trends themselves, which I think remain constant. I think the first trend that I would like to highlight that has accelerated as, in the past 10 months, or even more in the last 6 months since COVID, has been the trend of increasing US-China rivalry. And I think in the wake of COVID-19, some were quite hopeful that the United States and China would see that they had a mutual interest in resolving this and work together to defeat a common foe. I think what has become quite clear very quickly has been how ugly it's become. Instead of working together, the tussle, for example, over who's responsible for the virus and who's doing a better job of handling it. That's become part of this general geostrategic rivalry between the United States and China. So in the meantime as well, what we've seen China do is to push quite hard to win friends and influence in the region as it seeks to help Southeast Asian countries. I think in the meantime as well, what has also happened is we've seen regular strategic competition continue unabated. So we see that a lot in the South China Sea, which I work closely on, but also in other spheres. So the race to become dominant in high technologies like AI or quantum computing. And so far from halting or putting a pause button on geostrategic rivalry, we've seen that accelerate. The second trend I'd like to highlight is the propensity for weaker countries in the region to rely even more heavily on China. Now, I think there's been a lot of talk about how China has really flooded its post-COVID foreign policy, how it's been quite off-putting to Europe. Australia has taken quite a strong stance against China. India is upset with its border clashes. That may be the case as well in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia. But I think what's important to note is that countries in the region especially don't necessarily need to like the countries they work with. They like the countries that can support their national interests. And if China has that to offer and other countries do not, then we can expect them to continue with that general trend of relying more heavily on China. And so we will certainly see this for countries like Cambodia and Laos, who are already very much integrated into the Chinese economy. But I think the countries to watch in this respect will also be Indonesia, which was actively seeking Belt and Road Initiative projects from China even before COVID, and we're likely to see them seek more projects after to kind of help its economy recover after COVID-19. We're also likely to see that from Malaysia, which ushered in a new government in February. That government suffers from a lack of legitimacy and tons of infighting. And notably, it was also very close to the Chinese government when it was in power back in before May 2018 as well. So I think Indonesia and Malaysia are certainly the countries to watch in this respect. Now, a third trend that I think has accelerated since we last spoke, I think it was in August last year, was a further, though not decisive, shift in the balance of power towards China. And this is, of course, linked to the previous point I made, but I think this shift is not only related to the perceived strength or offerings that China brings to the table, but also to the United States' weakness. And I think there were already questions about US commitment to the region and its wherewithal pre-COVID. President Trump has accentuated some of these concerns. But I think post-COVID, we are seeing some of the deep structural issues that the United States faces really brought out into the open, and it's become glaringly obvious to some countries that the United States is a country that's struggling, both in terms of its foreign policy, but as well as its deep internal divisions. I think beyond the issue of capacity, what we're worried about here is we've seen the United States eschew its leadership role, both internationally as well as globally, as it responds to COVID-19. But it also appeared to shirk all responsibility in, taking actions which, in some cases, directly hurt the interests of its allies and partners, such as the diversion of masks meant for Germany from Thailand to the United States. So finally, the fourth trend that has accelerated since late last year has been an increase in the importance of the role played by middle powers in the region, so Japan, Australia, India. I think everyone's going to be looking at whether or not they step up to the plate to assist with upholding a rules-based order. I think Japan has done a fairly good job. When the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or TPP, I think Japan moved quite determinedly to ensure that the other countries signed what became the CPTPP. And also, after the United States launched its Indo-Pacific strategy, Japan very quickly put out its own Indo-Pacific vision to put wind behind the sails of the US strategy, so generating a sort of momentum behind the Indo-Pacific as a concept. The question now, of course, is whether countries like Australia and India will be able to step up to the plate. I think we've seen Australia do that, but in general, I think Australia might lack the necessary heft to do it alone, so we're going to need India. India has been quite averse to signing up to, say, the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is associated with the Indo-Pacific strategy, the more security-based angle of it. And in general has been reluctant to be strategic about its engagement with the region. We saw that when it withdrew from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and that was pilloried in a sense for how it showed an utter lack of a strategic awareness. But with the recent clashes with China on its border, I think we might see changes in India's positioning, but whether or not those clashes will be sufficient to kind of move it away from its tradition or its habit of non-alignment still remains to be seen, despite the very intense anti-Chinese rhetoric that's taking place in India right now.
Well, with your reference to rules-based order, you've already got a point in the Australian foreign policy community's favorite drinking game, because you reference rules-based order, which is a mantra here. And you're absolutely correct that that Japan, in their leadership in restoring the TPP and more broadly promoting rules-based order, has been seen by Australia as an essential partner, and India as an aspirational partner. I think you described it very well, so thank you. I really love the way you framed this as an acceleration, because if you recall, and we were both there last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong gave a great speech, which was basically an alarm, a call of alarm, or an expression of alarm at the U.S.-China relationship then and the trajectory. And yet I don't think anybody at that time would have seen the acceleration that we've just described, or you described so well. So I'm wondering if I can get you to play that forward a little bit. Is there an off-ramp? Is there a scenario in which the U.S. and China are able to find some type of common ground? Is it, we don't anticipate a change in China because, Xi Jinping is now emperor for life, right? But there is an upcoming election in the United States. Is that a hinge point? Can you just look forward a little bit on terms of that core relationship you described so well?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult to find an off-ramp that moves the relationship as a whole onto firmer footing. I think there's lots of talk about building strategic trust, and I think that Prime Minister Lee himself mentioned the need for that between the United States and China. And it's clear, of course, that strategic trust is important. It helps to ensure that perceptions are not distorted, which might in turn then precipitate a military or a political clash. It also ensures that countries can have a better footing in their relationship to work together in common challenges, as well as to seize opportunities for development. So strategic trust is important, and that's certainly something that we want to be looking for the US-China, to put the US-China relationship on a firmer footing in the future. But I think that's probably an unrealistic option in the near term. And it might arguably, in my view, also be undesirable. Why is it unrealistic? And this goes back to your question on whether we have a near-term off-ramp. Well, it's unrealistic because both sides of the aisle in the United States have determined that China is the United States' main strategic competitor. And both sides of the aisle in the United States feel that China is a danger to US interests. And this has been encapsulated in various US policy documents, the 2017 US National Security Strategy, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the 2019 Military Report on China's military. So various policy documents have firmly entrenched the view of China as the United States' main strategic competitor. And although the United States has not made the goals in the region entirely clear, and I suspect that this is because the US might not be entirely sure about the goals themselves, it seems by their words and actions increasingly that their goal is to maintain their dominance in the region, going beyond, of course, ensuring that China adheres to a rules-based order. And that might not be everyone in the United States, but I think actions and words increasingly show that, that's become the dominant thread of what the United States is seeking to do. China, on its part, has retained its impression that the United States is seeking to contain China and to constrain its rise. So its response, of course, has been to seek to exclude the United States from the region and increasingly to bolster or to boost Chinese influence in the region. Now, because these two goals are ultimately opposing, I think it would be quite hard to find an off-ramp for the relationship as a whole or to bolster strategic trust in the near term. Now, I think that, in my view, is akin to, seeking to bolster trust with a fox, in your hen house. It's a project that's doomed to failure and possibly unwise. If we look at the activities in the region, I think some of the problematic activities are continuing, and there's no two ways of looking at it. So even if you increase strategic trust, there's no way of reinterpreting China's actions, militarizing features in the South China Sea, which are disputed. They're hotly disputed. They're contested. These features have their sovereignty contested, but China has decided it doesn't matter. I'm just going to build on these features anyway. And in at least a couple of these features, a tribunal has clearly found that jurisdiction and control lies with the Philippines. So, greater trust is not going to change that picture of the situation. So my view is that the off-ramp comes in the form of, ensuring and identifying more discrete or limited areas of mutual interest, which the United States and China can work together on. And I think some areas would be, for instance, tackling climate change or the pandemic, where both parties are arguably roughly equally hurt by them, and both would be cutting off their nose to spite their faces if they did not address them together. I think trade is a far more difficult issue, namely because together with things like the technology battle, trade has become war by another means. And so it's become part of that strategic competition. So I think we probably have to go for the low-hanging fruits, such as climate change. It's still not low-hanging. I mean, the people.
I was about to say that's a pretty difficult low-hanging fruit there, but yeah.
Which only suggests how difficult the task before us is. But I think, climate change, tackling this pandemic would be some of the immediate tasks for fostering better relations. And also, I think we should also be looking at means by which we can minimize the risk of conflict. And so we have things like the 2014 Memorandum of Understanding. So this was the 2014 Memorandum of Understanding between the Department of Defense in the United States and China's Ministry of National Defense. And this was to set a set of rules for behavior at sea, for safety at sea and at air. And so we had the United States conclude that in 2014. Now we need parties to adhere to that. And we've had several near encounters, which I think fly in the face of that Memorandum of Understanding and that agreement, which are highly worrying. And so we need to be able to minimize the risk of conflict first by adhering to these rules, but also perhaps we could look at reforming multilateral institutions so that competition takes place within a certain framework, a safe framework, as well as perhaps setting up more unilaterals between the United States, China, and various other countries, so that we increase the sphere within which they can conduct dialogue and perhaps brainstorm for other ideas, for other areas in which they can agree to work together.
I think you've captured that very well. There is a fundamental tension between developments in the region, where, as you described it, almost fox in a hen house nature, right? And I've heard a very similar dialogue emerging from India as well, that with the recent developments there, it's increasingly clear to the strategic affairs community in India or Japan, with some in ASEAN, clearly Australia, that there is a fundamental contestation taking place right now. But there was always the belief that there were broader areas of cooperation. And you mentioned the low-hanging fruit of climate change, but broadly, the international rules-based order, the system in which we all rely upon, in which now we're all seeing deteriorate with alarming rapidity. I guess the fundamental question is that as long as the United States is weakening and attacking that rules-based order and multilateralism and international organizations like the WTO or the Paris Accords, et cetera, then it seems that we have less of a field in which the US and China might be able to work together. And so that's one of the changes that obviously would have to take place in the US before there would be a field for cooperation. Anyway, thank you. That was extremely insightful. Go ahead. You had another comment on that?
As well as whether a different administration might make a difference. And I think one area in which a different administration might make an important, not a huge difference, but an important difference nonetheless, is in the sphere of just rhetoric. I think the rhetoric between the United States and China has become very heated, unnecessarily heated. And I think we need both sides to start toning down that rhetoric. We've seen China able to kind of dial it up and scale it down, but unfortunately, this US administration seems quite incapable of that. So perhaps a different administration would do a better job in that respect.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier the mantra in Australia of rules-based order. That really manifests itself in the form of multilateralism. And you being in Singapore, which is the centerpiece of so many of these regional organizations, I think will understand that better than most. I remember early on in the Trump administration going to Washington, D.C., meeting with a very senior White House official and asking them for one single example of where the Trump administration and approach would support a multilateral initiative. And they just said, this administration just does not think that way. And now, 3.5 years later, it's quite clear, whether it's in the trade realm or the security range or the nuclear non-proliferation range, et cetera, multilateralism has not been the name of the game. And yet, for Singapore, for Japan, for Australia, that has been a fundamental national strategy to build and strengthen that rules-based order. So, thank you.
Shame. Just to tag on to your point, I think it's such a shame that this administration has not seen it fit to bolster multilateral institutions and the rules-based order, because nothing boosts the United States more than the multilateral order, the multilateral institutions that it had a hand in setting up, and nothing undermines the national project more than a failure to cooperate and work through these institutions. So it is a real shame, I think, that we're seeing from this current US administration, and it's hurting the US administration, and it's hurting everyone else in this part of the world and the rest of the world as well.
Well, flowing directly from that conversation, in Singapore, you've got unique perspective on ASEAN, on multilateralism, regional organizations within the region. ASEAN has had a really challenging period of time, obviously, given the tensions that you've discussed already in this conversation. But it seems to be facing a particularly insidious challenge now in the form of COVID-19. In the early months, this was a China story. Then briefly, it was a Europe story. For the last 3 months, and I'm afraid for months to come, it will be largely a US story. But there is growing evidence that whether it's Indonesia or ASEAN more broadly, that we haven't seen the worst of it yet. Can you just talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, how it's being viewed from ASEAN, and then what implication that might have for ASEAN's position in the world?
Let me first start with how ASEAN countries in general have fared in their responses to COVID-19. And I think the response has been varied, as has success rates. Let me caveat my comments first by saying that these are still very early days of the virus. So, and some estimates, I think the WHO lead scientist has said that the virus might last well up to 4 years. So we have no vaccine before then. We're looking at 4 hard years, or at least 3 more hard years. And the second caveat that I would have, of course, is that some of the figures coming out from some countries in ASEAN might not truly be reflective of the situation on the ground. So those are my 2 caveats. But I think by and large, what we can see in ASEAN is some success cases and some I wouldn't say outright failures, but less successful cases. And I think the star performer in this respect has been Vietnam, which despite its proximity to China and its lack of resources to carry out mass testing, has fared very well. And I think the last time I checked, which was just a couple of days ago, it had 0 deaths. So Vietnam has certainly done a very good job in this respect. Singapore as well has received accolades internationally for its response to COVID-19. And as someone living in Singapore, I feel generally very safe. I think Singapore's record has since been blighted by the high infection rates in worker dormitories. So unfortunately, some of our foreign workers live in very tightly packed dormitories, and their dormitories have been infected. This is very unfortunate, and I think the Singapore government has sought to provide all the support they can for these poor workers. But by and large, this is a localized problem, and the community infection rate in Singapore remains relatively low. So Vietnam and Singapore have been relatively good examples of how to handle COVID-19. The less good examples, I would say, on the flip side, we have countries like Indonesia and Philippines. Indonesia took a long time to recognize there was a problem. And by that time, and after they recognized it was a problem, I think they took about a week before they actually acted on the problem. It canceled large religious gatherings, but only after a large number of people already traveled for them. So there was a spread that was completely unnecessary. Already as it stands, Indonesia has the highest fatality rate in the region at, I think, over 5%. So Indonesia is clearly facing a COVID problem. And as you mentioned earlier, we haven't seen the worst of it yet. I think we can expect the numbers to spike far higher than we are already seeing from Indonesia. And I think the other country that has fared relatively poorly, though I think their rates of the mortality rates had dropped in the past couple of weeks, has been the Philippines. So that has also fared. That country has also fared quite poorly relative to the rest of Southeast Asia. Gordon, if I may, I'd like to address one argument that I've seen come up, and perhaps the examples of Singapore and Vietnam on the one hand, and the Philippines and Indonesia on the other hand, support this argument, but I think it's a completely false narrative. So one explanation for why some countries do better than others, and I'm sure you've seen this, has been political regime. And the narrative that, authoritarian regimes do far better than democracies in handling crises, including COVID-19, this has been gaining traction in the region. And I find that very unfortunate, because I find it a completely flawed argument. It's also a dangerous argument, but first of all, it's flawed. Now, why is it flawed? First of all, why has it gained such traction? I think the reason why it's gained traction was at a time, if you remember, around mid-March, when we saw China get its numbers under control with no new COVID infections. And on the other hand, we had Europe seeing, we had pictures of hospitals in chaos. So we had the numbers of deaths and infections spike in Europe as well as in America. And there was complete chaos, at least from this part of the world. And that allowed that narrative to take root. And what we've also seen since then is what we've also seen since then is, as I mentioned, Singapore and Vietnam, nominally authoritarian states, and you've had Philippines and Indonesia, both electoral democracies, and the contrast in their performance. So one might argue that there you go, there's more support from the region for this narrative that authoritarian states are far better in handling crisis. But I think it's a flawed argument, and once you pull back and look at a bigger series of cases from Asia alone, like if we look at Taiwan and South Korea and how they've responded, both liberal democracies, both allowing for voluntary uptake of measures, both have done really well. I think Taiwan's mortality rate is something like 1 point something, and South Korea is 2.2, the last I checked. So I think we need to move away. We need to put that final nail in that coffin of that argument. I do not want to see another commentary on that, because it's wrong. And it's dangerous, because what we're seeing now is some countries in the region, including electoral democracies like the Philippines, start to employ more and more authoritarian measures, including the excessive use of force, which is problematic, and seeking to entrench their control in the country. And we've seen Cambodia initially completely unperturbed. Prime Minister Hun Sen was completely unperturbed by COVID-19. But what we've seen him since do is to decide to pass a national security or a national emergency law, which allows both for the handling of pandemics, but also for martial law in the event of national chaos, whatever that means. So it's very vague, and it certainly allows Prime Minister Hun Sen and his regime to further entrench its already deeply entrenched powers. I think if we're looking for explanatory factors in how some countries in ASEAN have fared better or worse, I think we would do a better job by looking more at first speedy implementation of effective policies. So effective policies, I think, are critical. Second, the bureaucratic capacity to both communicate these policies as well as to implement them. And third, trust in the population of the government, because this helps to lower the cost of getting compliance from the population. And I think another factor that has really helped the region has been the experience of SARS. I think countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, they all learned the bitter lessons of SARS in the early 2000s, and they all sought to implement measures for when the next pandemic struck or when the next epidemic struck. And we saw Vietnam set up, disease control centers around the country, and Singapore has its national it has a national disease control center as well that is set up, as well as certain contingency plans for tracing and quarantining confirmed contacts of COVID cases. So,
well, thank you. That's a very comprehensive and helpful overview. And as you mentioned, it's still early days in this. Your focus on both past experience and core competencies, in terms of policymakers and bureaucracies, is really, really telling. And it I think probably could be applied to a lot of other issues beyond COVID-19 as well. Well, look, I want to wrap up with a topic that you've spent a lot of time talking over the last 7 months, and I won't ask you to kind of summarize the body of your knowledge in just 5 minutes, but I'd like to focus on territorial disputes in the region. You've spoken so eloquently about the South China Seas in many different fora. And I have to confess here that I used to have a certain jealousy of professors who somehow got a gig of traveling around cruise ships and giving lectures on foreign policy on a cruise ship, because I'd never been on a cruise, and it seemed like a great idea at the time. And now I realize I don't really want to go on a cruise anymore. I have a new jealousy, and that's you. I saw that you actually went to Greece for 3 weeks and attended the Rhodes Academy of Ocean Law. So now I have this desire to be a maritime law specialist, so I can go hang out in Greece for a while, at least pre-COVID as well on that front. Can you tell us a little bit, just give us kind of your view of recent developments? You've already alluded to some fundamental changes that took place in terms of South China Seas, in terms of the UN Convention Law of the Sea, the UN tribunals ruling on the Philippines. But this is an issue that is kind of at the crux of Asia Pacific, at least now, security today. Can you help us understand the state of play in the South China Seas, in the current environment that we've just discussed for the last half hour, what we should be focusing on? What are the areas of concern to you? So state of play, areas of concern to you, and how you think things are likely to develop, if that's a simple enough question to kind of wrap up on there. So.
I realize as well that I forgot to answer your question on ASEAN's performance on COVID, and I'll answer that very briefly because there hasn't been very much, unfortunately. I think ASEAN has convened a series of meetings with its member states as well as with its various dialogue partners. It's also issued various statements in terms of the importance of cooperating and responding to the pandemic. But I think it's not really moved beyond rhetoric towards greater action. So that's my response to ASEAN. And I'll now talk about a very good question in the South China Sea. You know, what's the state of play? The state of play is not great, but it's not. But I think we're seeing some bright sparks. So that's in one line, how I see it. The state of play has worsened, in fact, since we spoke in August 2019, in minor ways, but they're significant. What we're seeing now is China encroaching upon the exclusive economic zones of Indonesia, Vietnam, and most recently Malaysia. So it's actually sought to conduct survey activities in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. It's also sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel. It's conducting survey activities as well in Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. And as of, I think it was late April, early May, if I'm not wrong, also harassed a vessel called the West Capella, which had been hired by the state oil company Petronas to conduct survey operations in Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. This, I think, is a clear flouting of the 2016 UN tribunal ruling that the Philippines brought against China. That ruling clarifies that all littoral states, I think, well, the implication of that ruling is that all littoral states around the South China Sea enjoy the exclusive economic zone unencumbered either by China's 9-dash line or by any exclusive economic zone generated from either a feature or a group of features in the Spratlys. So there's no basis for China. China cannot use either the 9-dash line or an exclusive economic zone projected from any feature or group of features in the Spratlys for saying that they're entitled to some of these rights in the waters of the South China Sea that overlap with littoral states EEZ. So the recent Chinese actions are clearly problematic. The second problematic activity in the South China Sea has been China's near constant presence around several features that are occupied by or administered by countries in the region. So it's had a near constant presence around Malaysia's Luconia shoals since 2013. And since then has also decided to send hundreds of vessels to surround a Philippines-occupied, the largest Philippines-occupied territory in the South China Sea, T2 Island. This came to light late, in the middle of last year and has been spasmodic, but continues to this date. This is not necessarily unlawful because Chinese vessels, all vessels enjoy a right of innocent passage around any territorial waters and high sea freedoms beyond territorial waters around any feature. But I think the numbers and the persistence of Chinese vessels around these features occupied by or administered by other countries are aimed at intimidation and control. I think the third problem that we're seeing probably escalate a little bit has been Chinese objections to US and allied presence, assertions of maritime rights and freedoms in the South China Sea. And this obviously is clearly inconsistent with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees maritime rights and freedoms. China ratified the convention in 1996, and the United States abides by it as a matter of customary international law and domestic policy. And there has been recent reports of an air defense identification zone. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense actually stated, I think in April or May, that China was about to declare one, was going to declare one, but I think it's since walked back its statement. So we are not clear why they talked about it or whether or not that's going to go ahead. You asked about state of play and areas of concern, and I think I highlighted both of them together. And so you talked about how it will develop. The bright spark I was talking about earlier was the fact that although we still haven't seen countries facing problems in the South China Sea get together and sort of come up with a cohesive and strong response, either amongst themselves or with ASEAN, what we've seen recently has been greater clarity that all relevant countries apart from China are operating under the same understanding of the law. And I think this came about as a likely unintended consequence of Malaysia's submission to the CLCS, which is the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. This is a UN commission, and Malaysia submitted a claim to an extended continental shelf in December 2019 last year. And China responded to object to Malaysia's claims, but what that response elicited was responses from Philippines, and then followed by Vietnam, and most recently Indonesia and the United States. Now, I think the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesian statements were all very clear in setting out first that all claims need to abide by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Second, that China's maritime rights and jurisdiction claims do not abide by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And third, that they all agreed that the 2016 tribunal ruling is an authoritative interpretation of international law. So there is a consensus, and I think the United States at the start of this month actually also issued their own statement, which broadly agreed with this consensus statement. I think that's
so to be clear, to make sure I understand what you're saying, is that initially when the UN tribunal came out with its ruling in the Philippines, most countries in the region were very quiet. Nobody wanted to say anything about it. But by responding so strongly to the Malaysian claims, China's essentially pushed the other claimant states and even states outside there to clarify their support for, some of the underlying principles in the UN in the tribunal's ruling. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
So in 2016, all ASEAN, none of the ASEAN countries actually talked about China needing to abide by the tribunal's ruling. All of them sort of mentioned the need to abide by international law and UNCLOS, but no one kind of stuck the ruling in China's face and say, here's a ruling by the UN tribunal and you guys should abide by it. I think these statements are clearer on that front, and they're clearer that these countries are all accepting of the tribunal's substantive findings as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's extremely insightful. I could go on for another hour, but we've already more than exhausted the promised time that we gave to you. And I'm extremely confident that what will happen after this interview is that our readers, our people who are viewing this video, will look up the wonderful presentation you gave to AIIA, the ones you gave to La Trobe Asia, and your own writings there. So thank you so much for helping us understand an extremely complex region and an extremely complex set of issues that we've been able to discuss. I wanted to end by saying how much I hope that the World Health Organization is wrong, that this won't be 4 years of being cut off, that we will be able to see you in person again in Singapore at either the Fullerton Forum or the Shangri-La Dialogue next year. Or if not that sooner rather than later, we'll be able to entice you once again down here to Perth. But Lynn, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. And we look forward to future engagements.
Thank you so much, Gordon. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It's such a pleasure to see you again. And like you, I hope it won't be too long before we can meet in person again. So from your lips and my lips to God's ears. See you soon, I hope.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.